The employee looked at me and said, I didn't think I could even do that job, so I never even thought about applying. Welcome to Executive Evolution. I have over 25 years of leadership experience in corporate America. I learned a lot of lessons the hard way, and I created this podcast so that you won't have to. One of the really interesting things about the last larger business that I ran, it was a call center business, and call center jobs tend to be entry-level jobs. And one of the real privileges I had in that position was seeing people who had opportunities to grow beyond that role. And I will never forget a conversation I had with one of those teammates where we had an opening kind of outside of the call center, but still a phone-related job, business development rep job. And we posted those, and I really thought he'd be good for that role, but I didn't even see him applying for the role. And I had pulled him aside and shared with him kind of, this is something I see in you. I see this ability to actually move into this role. It's a little risky. There's incentive sides to it, but I really think this is a place you could excel. And he looked me in the eye and just said, I don't even think I could do that. I didn't think I could even do that job. And so I never thought to apply. And I really encouraged him to do so. And he did well in that role. So one of the real privileges of leadership is being able to help people grow. And that's one of the stories that come up in my interview today with Dan Fahrner, who is the founder and CEO of Shake Up Cocktails. So let's jump in right now and hear the story of his executive evolution. Dan, welcome to the Executive Evolution Podcast. I'm so glad you could be here today.
Thanks, Craig. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. We did a lot of work together in the past, and I'm really excited to hear about all the things you've got going on with Shake Up and how that's happened for you over the last few years.
Excellent. Can't wait to share. Absolutely. And it's great to reconnect.
Yes, absolutely. Let's jump in. Are you ready for the lightning round, Dan?
I'm ready, baby.
All right. Lightning round question 1. What is the best leadership book you have ever read?
Yeah, best leadership book for me has to be Shoe Dog, which is a memoir by Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. It's very much a narrative-driven story, but so many phenomenal leadership lessons. Really, it's a great startup book because he built the business from nothing, like literally just selling shoes out of his car. It's this gigantic business, global business, including being one of the first US companies selling abroad in China, things like that. But, he's just got a fun, unique, quirky attitude and great lessons all around. Love that book.
Yeah, he always seems to me like one of those kind of larger than life leaders, kind of like Richard Branson, where there's just so much and they don't seem to take themselves super seriously, but the business really seriously. And I don't know if that's Phil Knight, but that seems like him to me.
No, absolutely. You're very much correct in that.
All right. Question number 2. Who is your leadership crush?
Yeah, leadership crush is a local fella that you know well, Craig. His name's Jeb Banner. The reason I bring him up, he's actually a mentor of mine, somebody that I worked for many years ago when Craig and I worked together. He just has some really unique qualities individually that I think are just aspirational from a leadership standpoint. For one, he's just a phenomenal human, fantastic mentor. Number 2, he's just a great business mind. So he's somebody that understands kind of all aspects of businesses, building them from scratch, from almost nothing to, fundraising, to scaling, et cetera, et cetera. But then the last aspect of him as a person, which I think is just very phenomenal, aspirational, is that on the personal side, he's very spiritual. He would define himself as a Christian. He has a very unique ethos, and it allows him to seemingly balance his work life in just kind of a perfect way. And so all that to say, I'm grateful for all the lessons that he taught me, but there's a lot that I still need to learn. And so a lot of his style and that kind of like that balance is something that I aspire to grow in as well.
Yeah, I actually have had Jeb on the podcast. He was one of the early guests. And I think in all the work I've done with him in connection with him over the years, it's kind of that balance and calm, right? And I always talk at the end of this podcast about confidence, competence, and calm as crucial leadership characteristics. And he manages to just kind of perspectivize, which isn't a word, in a way that's just really unique, I think. He's just in a great serial entrepreneur, never doesn't have an idea for something cool.
Absolutely. He's always working on something wacky. And, right now it's AI. In the past, it was music. He and I met through the music community. And and playing music and concert promotion. So, it runs the gamut for sure.
Absolutely. All right, cool. Last one. In 10 words or less, how do you define leadership?
Yeah, I think this is going to be less than 10. Inspiring others to be great. Couple aspects of that for me, the inspirational piece. I mean, I think that most folks in a leadership role know that the active management can be challenging, tedious, frustrating, like interpersonal relationship management is very difficult. It's hard to do. So, obviously there's kind of two paths you can go down. Path one is like more of a positive. The other is more of a negative. On the positive side, you've got inspiration, inspiring others, positive reinforcement. The negative side is where, you're using negative reinforcement, being critical, shaming, what have you, and I spent many years working as a leadership coach, and oftentimes you could see where the breakdown exists in an organization due to those management styles. And a lot of it has to do with, individuals and how happy or satisfied or fulfilled they are in their own lives. So anyway, inspiration over negativity. And then to be great, like obviously we want to push people to grow, to excel in their roles and things like that. And so oftentimes you have to figure out, all right, what motivates them, right? What's the motivational aspect? So how can you inspire them to kind of reach beyond whatever their perceived ceiling is? And so to me, it's important to use that positivity to inspire, and then also to help people kind of reach beyond what they believe their perceived ceiling is, not just in the workplace, but in life as well. And so, to me, there's, again, speaking back to the balance that we just described, that's really, really important. So that's my answer. I'm sticking with it.
No, I love that, because one of the things, like in the last bigger business I ran, it was largely a call center business. And one of the things that was so cool is you got to know those folks, and obviously very entry level job, but you could start to see in people what they could actually do beyond just sitting on those phones, and start talking to them about, I could see you doing this. I could see you here. How do we help you get there? And that's such a huge, like, privilege of leadership. It's not all privilege. Sometimes it's exhausting. It's like juggling bowling balls. But when you can do stuff like that, where you're actually like changing a life in a positive way, that's also, by the way, beneficial for the business, that's really cool.
It's super fulfilling. Absolutely. That's the win-win.
It's really what actually made me, when we ended up selling that business, why I went this way and moved into kind of like business coaching and leadership coaching, because that's what I was enjoying, was helping lift people up, not growing. I mean, growing the business is fun, but actually changing people's lives is actually a much more interesting thing to do every day. So,
oh, absolutely. And adding value to the world at the same time.
All right. So let's go back, Dan, not today, but what do you consider to be the first leadership role you've ever had?
Honestly, the first leadership role I ever had was probably when I was a performing starving artist musician touring the country. Right when I graduated college, I went through the entrepreneurship program at Ball State University here in Indiana, in Muncie, Indiana, and you had to write a business plan in order to graduate, and you had to sell it. There was no financial aspect to it, no money exchange, but you had to go through the entire process. It was pass fail. So when I finished the process, I was grilled for a couple hours in the business plan presentation portion. And afterwards, they asked me, so are you going to start this business? Which was actually, it was an electronic medical records system service. Not something I had a ton of interest in, but something I had some background in. And they said, are you going to start this business? And I said, I think I'm going to go on tour with my band. So interestingly enough, I moved down to Indianapolis into a house on Butler University's campus with my bandmates, and we literally spent about 3 years touring the country. I learned so much about leadership from that. I mean, we were roommates. We were living, sleeping on people's floors, living in a van together, eating meals together. And it wasn't every day of every year, but, we were united by that. And we were a team, right? We had our individual roles. I was, manager, booking agent, business guy, I guess you could say, band dad. We had songwriter, that was his primary focus. We had a couple creatives who would help with marketing and et cetera, et cetera. And so, just trying to figure out how to kind of run the business portion was just very challenging. Also working with creatives, people who are like uber creative, yet we were 21, 22 years old. So not necessarily fully emotionally developed at that time, myself included. And so there were just tons and tons of conflict, as you can imagine, being in such close quarters, and just so many lessons. And to the point where, I think I burned myself out pretty quickly, truly, because I took it so seriously and I was pushing so hard, and I wasn't inspiring others to be great, as we just discussed. I was dictating or demanding and expecting, and obviously it didn't work. That was my first kind of big leadership role, and pretty unique, different, but so many learning experiences as a part of it.
Well, and I think that's interesting because in some ways, with a smaller business that's growing, right, it does almost feel like a family. Maybe you're not all sleeping in a van together and traveling the country, but you are spending a ton of time together. What did you take away within that from kind of leading with that proximity and kind of also just being thrust into it because that was kind of the default? Well, if you're the the agent guy, you were thrust into it. So like, what were some of the big takeaways of what made that work and didn't work?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things was like touring for us was a means to building awareness, right? Like there were social media and like internet tools that were being developed at the time or helping propel us on the digital side, but those were still pretty relatively new, and there were only certain demographics that would use it. So in order to kind of get in front of people and, actually make money, you had to be out on the road performing. And so then you kind of walk backwards from that and think, all right, what has to happen in order for us to be out on the road for this amount of time? First things first, you have to have paying gigs, but do the gigs actually pay for the entire tour? That kind of thing. Secondly, we have to, have our kind of like basic needs met financially, like thinking about paying rent and insurance and for food and things like that. And so, if the gigs weren't necessarily paying for our entire livelihood, then we had to find flexible jobs that would allow us to go on tour and come back and work and that kind of thing. And so then that takes it a step further, like, all right, so I guess for me, it was thinking through like how to make sure that everybody on the team in the band had the ability to have that flexibility and then also prioritize what we were doing, as like kind of their primary focus, right? So it was like inspiring, making sure that our people felt inspired by what we were doing constantly, right? Things like showing and telling them like, the wins that we're having, like from a marketing standpoint, or, like if we're being played on the radio, making a big deal out of that. So all kinds of things here, like, there's like kind of like that logistical aspect where it was like, if I'm band dad, I need to make sure that we have a house or a living situation that we can all afford. So that's like thinking about people on a personal level, right? And then inspiring them to like bring their greatest to each show, each recording, each rehearsal, that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of positive reinforcement that has to go into that. So just all kinds of interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's crazy. So if you had to kind of nail like the one thing that you really still use today from that experience, what do you think it would be?
I think it would be like probably treating my team as though they're like family. Part of the challenge of leadership is that you have to manage expectations constantly, right?
Yeah.
And set expectations constantly. But if you're doing it from a position of, I care for you, I care about you, it comes across as more genuine. And then the relationship is a two-way relationship. And it's not just
Right.
hey, you're doing this for me kind of thing. So to me, that's probably the biggest thing. And I still use that today. And I would say that, that still works wonders for me, at least.
All right. Well, so let's talk more about today. So today you've got Shake Up Cocktails, High and Mighty Distillery. You founded this about 3 or 4 years ago. How does your leadership style, and you've had obviously a lot of leadership opportunities in between. So, how has your leadership style evolved from back then?
That's a great question. I'll show you here. This is an example of our product, lemon shake up can cocktail. So we started a distillery at the Indiana State Fairgrounds here in Midtown Indianapolis. We launched the brand in 2022, launched the lemon shake up can cocktail, which is kind of a classic fair county fair, state fair flavor. We put it into a can and mixed it with locally made gin that we make, and it is dynamite. We use all real stuff, and so you kind of taste the difference. And so when people tried it, we launched it at the fair in 2022. It just took off in a way that we couldn't have expected. At that time, I was part-time. In fact, I would say that this January here in 2025 was both my wife and I took our first paycheck from the business, which was very exciting.
Oh, wow.
It's a labor of love for sure. But, I had been working consulting and, flexibility, just like I had described with the band, that has occurred here in this business. Anyway, I give that context just so people kind of have an understanding of what the business looks like. There's 3 founding partners, and maybe one of the first ways that I had brought some of those leadership lessons from early on into this business is that when we set out to start the business, we knew pretty quickly that we could probably manage, and this is my wife and I should say, we knew we wanted to go into business together. We work very well together. We've, had the most challenging leadership lesson there is, which is parenting and raising 4 boys. We have 4 kids in 4 years, and so you learn a lot there. Anyway, we knew that when we wanted to start the business, we had the ability to probably build the business, build the brand, kind of launch the logistical aspects of it. However, the most important thing was the product, the end product, because obviously if people try it and it's not very good, they're not going to buy it again.
Right.
Or they're not going to buy it the first time. Right. So we knew that was incredibly important. It sounds obvious, but you wouldn't believe how many brands in our space exist and their product is just mediocre or frankly not very good. Anyway, in order to do that, we had needed to have somebody who really could bring their A game to flavor development. And so we kind of looked around our network, and sure enough, we had a friend that we had met and worked with over the course of 10 years through church, actually. His background is in food and restaurants, so opening restaurants, running kitchens like Petit Chu and Broad Ripple. He was the number 2 at the Patty Chu company for about 5 years before COVID. So we contacted him and just said, hey, here's kind of what we're considering. Is this something you'd ever be interested in helping with? Not like, hey, we want you to be our partner like full time, but you might be able to contribute and we can kind of see how it goes. And he was like, immediately was like, yeah, I'm in. Like, well, hang on, Mike. Don't you want to like think about this? And I think he was pretty burned out on the restaurant world, but treating people like family, so this is somebody who we've known for a very long time. And obviously there are risks with that, which is that like, if the bridge gets burned, it's deep because This is somebody that you've known, have a personal relationship with for a very long time. But I believe that this entire business, all of the kind of individual steps that led us up to starting it were very divine. And so, he was put in our life for a reason. He said yes for a reason. And so wouldn't you know it, it turns out that he's our secret weapon, right? And not only is he phenomenal at what he does on the flavor development side, because we have a product that people absolutely love and are buying over and over constantly, but he also is a really sharp guy and built our distillery. He's also great at sales. So it's like, if you can find people and inspire them, they can do great things. And so I'm not saying that that's like, something that I wake up every day and know exactly what to do, but I think that we found a method that works for us, and especially with people that match our values. And here we are.
Yeah. And, one of the things when I hear the story and, you had such a clear vision, right? We're going to have all natural flavors where, all these things that you talked about. Casting a clear vision to me is one of the crucial things for any business, right? You can inspire people all day long, but you're inspiring them to a vision. And if that's not clear, how do they know where they're going? So what were the steps for you kind of in the early days to say, all right, this is really, the business we're going to create? What helped you drive into that really focused vision?
Oh, great question. It's interesting too, because the vision has changed pretty dramatically, which tends to happen in startups. But I think at the beginning, we employed quite a bit of like vision casting exercises. You and I in the past have gone through some of those exercises when we work together. And so we use some of those to kind of like collectively make sure that between the 3 of us, we were very well aligned in what we were building, right? And we had a pretty clear vision, which at the time when we were building this was, we are going to build a destination distillery bar restaurant experience. And we ended up partnering with the Indiana State Fair because they actually have about 2 million people that come through their gates in terms of foot traffic per year. Not quite half of that is the Indiana State Fair, which is about 3 weeks in August. The rest, I mean, there are events there constantly. So the idea was, okay, we can build a place. We have existing foot traffic. All we have to do then is pull them in, right? So we worked together through creative exercises just to make sure we were aligned to do that. And we were meeting constantly. So it's just so much communication, right? However, once we launched the canned cocktail, we realized very quickly that this is the future of the business. It's not a place. Yeah. And interestingly enough, economically at the time in 2021, interest rates were skyrocketing and it became much harder to borrow money from banks if you're pre-revenue. You know, it just kind of, the vision changed and then we had to go through that process again. We launched products. We found that we may have a product that may be able to scale for us. And so then we decided, and this is again through working together like very closely in using some EOS practices like on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis to essentially reformat the business around the product and not necessarily the distillery. So today we have a distillery. It is not open to the public, but it is a giant warehouse. It is filled with canned cocktails. It can be a very fun place to hang out, but it's not a bar. And so I'm very grateful to not be running a bar and, you know, having to worry about staffing in that same way. But this business has all kinds of challenges with it too. So anyway, hopefully that helps.
No, it does. And what's so cool about that, and you know, I talk a lot to people about, you know, make the decision to go, because we can get into this whole like paralysis by analysis and try and get to the perfect beast. And what's important is just get to the point where you can go, get enough, pull as much data together and go and start moving down the path. And then what I really appreciate about the story is you got to a point and you realized, you know what, we're banging up into a wall. This isn't going to work. Now I have new information and I'm going to take that in and I'm going to make the pivot, right? So, so much is important is to say, take the action. But as soon as you start to realize that maybe there's a flaw in that action, don't be so, you know, egotistical or convinced that you're always right to not say, hey, you know what? I think one of our assumptions was flawed. Let's try this and make that pivot, right?
Absolutely.
And I can imagine the issues you deal with today, I'm sure are not zero, but the amount of issues if you had a full run bar restaurant and, you know, dozens more employees and all that, it would be a very different business with very different challenges, especially now when things are such a struggle.
Absolutely. I think that we would have had a much lower ceiling as a business and also then you're just focusing on driving foot traffic individuals constantly. Whereas now in our world, it's, you know, how big can we scale this nationally to the point where, you know, there may be portfolio brands who are interested in bringing us into their portfolio that, you know, we have options, which I'm grateful to say. But to your point, yes, I think that no matter what, there's risks in being conservative and sticking with your original plan. There's risks in pivoting, but I've always kind of been under the assumption that, like with new information, as you said, you got to go for it and, you know, obviously weigh the risks, but don't be afraid to make a big pivot.
Yeah. And one other thing, and you mentioned this, I think, before we started recording, is a lot of your business is kind of not full-time people. You kind of have this army of people who are kind of ambassadors for your brand and do different things. From a leadership perspective, I think almost like with a not-for-profit too, you have kind of this vast number of people who are doing things for you who may not be full-time. How do you kind of take that vision and that inspiration to greatness to people who aren't necessarily in your office all day, every day, where you can really interact like that? How do you kind of press that vision forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly we're still learning on that front. But so we have about 30 part-time folks who help us as what we call brand ambassadors, who are out on the front lines as I am. I'm more focused on the sales side, working directly with accounts that would be like liquor stores, bars, and restaurants. These folks are running events for us, interfacing with consumers. So they're in liquor stores, sampling out products. They're, you know, at beer fests, you know, sampling product, you know, you name it. We've got, I mean, this year at this point, we're tracking to do somewhere around 500 plus events across Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And so not only is there a challenge in like keeping people motivated locally, but also then like people who are, we don't even see them, in Illinois and in Wisconsin. Right. And that is challenging.
Right.
I can't say that we have it figured out 100%. There are some models that other brands use that are kind of tried and true on the logistics side, but the motivation is definitely challenging. Money does help, right? If you can pay people well, it helps them feel valued, and that's very important. And what we've done, I think that is maybe a little unique, is we've built in some incentives to the ambassador program where, let's just use kind of a more classic example. We've got somebody who in a Total Wine doing a sampling from 3 to 6 on Friday. They get paid X dollar amount per hour just to kind of do that, run that activity. However, we've also built in incentives that if they go above and beyond on the sales side, they get bonus. So if they sell over 2 cases of product, which would be about 12 4-packs, they get a financial bonus. If they talk to the manager and relay some information back to us that is really valuable, boom, they get bonus. If they merchandise the shelves for us, so like clean up the shelf, make sure that, all of our products are as presentable as possible, they get bonus. If they bring in email addresses for us, they get bonus. So we have all these bonuses in place, and most folks at this point, they're going for it completely, because if they're out there spending their time, they might as well, try and hit the full bonus amount. And that helps. And obviously, pay is not everything, but it incentivizes them not only to like work harder, go above and beyond, but to kind of like think bigger picture about the business. Right. And so for us, these email addresses are valuable because it allows us to stay in touch with folks. They can buy our products online or through our website. And one of the main drivers of that is email address. So, it makes a lot of sense. Our relationships with these accounts is incredibly valuable. So if it's not just me or our sales manager talking with a buyer, but also they realize that the brand ambassador who's out there doing sampling cares about their business, then boom, that's adding value. So our whole goal is to add value to our customers. And we can do that if we're treating our people well, we're paying them well, et cetera.
Well, and you've aligned their interests with your interests, right? Collecting email addresses, making sure the product's presentable, pushing the product, right? All those things are ways to get people aligned, even though they're in Wisconsin or we're, far, far away, and maybe you've never met you in person. That's great.
Yep.
Well, Dan, we always like to kind of wrap up Executive Evolution with one question. You get to jump in a time machine, H.G. Wells, Back to the Future, whatever your preferred method of time travel is. Go back to you in that first leadership role. What's the one piece of advice you would give yourself that would have made it easier, made you better, helped you advance things faster? What's the one thing you'd go back and share?
Oh, man, I've got a really good one that's like I'm still so challenged by. Enjoy the process and don't just focus on the future and the outcomes so much. It's really hard to in business, but I'll liken it back to my band experience. Recording an album is a very unique experience. It's challenging in that, there's this kind of pressure on the performance side. I am a drummer. So for me, it was you got to get the perfect take, right? You got to make sure that your bandmates are kind of doing the same thing, that they're in it in the same way that you are. They're focused, right? You got to make sure you're getting good sleep. Your relationship with your engineer is dynamite. So there's just a lot that goes into it, even, the sonic qualities, all the technology, et cetera, et cetera. For me back then, it was, we need to finish this album so we can get out on tour and make money. Whereas I would tell myself today, hey, focus on making the best album you possibly can. Do whatever it takes to make the beer taste better. Everything else will fall in line from that. It's not like your work is done if you make a great album, but if you don't make a great album, your work is done. You're not going very far. So you might as well just focus on enjoying the process and doing the absolute best you can. And so today in my work, there's so much that, I'm focused on. It's the version of creating an album today is either creating a new product or launching a brand campaign or what have you. And so oftentimes it's like, all right, we need to get this launched so that we can do X, right? But in reality, I'm going to look back at this time and I'm not going to remember what the urgent goal was that I was focused on. I'm going to remember what it is that we were building. And so I just want to be able to focus on that and enjoy the process.
It's so funny you say that, because what just flashed on my mind is, I look back at like a 25-year career, and I know, and I was stressed out all the time because I didn't enjoy the process, right? Because I was so worried about the outcomes. But now as I look back on it, what I remember was the team coming together, the people who supported each other, the victories that we had, right? The cool, crazy moments. That's the stuff that you actually take with you from these experiences. So why not try to enjoy the ride? Love it. Well, so Dan, if people want to know more about you, more about the company, where can they find you online?
Sure. Yeah. drinkshakeup.com is our website. You will find all kinds of fun info about our products. You can buy them online. You can find events, etc., that may be close to you. We're very active on social media. So at Drink Shakeup is, your account on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever you like to hang out on social. That's probably the best way to find us. I'm the primary person behind our social media. So if you ever want to reach out, I'm the one that's going to say hi on the other side. So feel free to.
Perfect. Well, Dan, thanks so much for coming on, sharing the story of your executive evolution, and best of luck as you guys continue to grow.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Boy, I really enjoyed my interview with Dan today. I hadn't seen him in several years, brought him onto the podcast, and he's had a lot of success with this business that he's launched. And I was so excited to hear the story of that and kind of how he's grown as a leader over his career, especially in kind of this startup founder environment. So let's jump into the 3 takeaways in the areas of confidence, competence, and calm in Dan's story. In the area of confidence, he talked about creating a vision, and that's really important when we're creating our business. Is we want to have a vision. I take my clients through building a very specific vision that's either 3 to 5 years out. The thing is, though, as Dan got in new information that they didn't have at the time of the vision, he realized he needed to pivot, or the company and the company realized they need to pivot. And that's confidence, realizing that, we're executing as well as we can on this vision. But when we're presented with new information, we're not going to be so arrogant or so stubborn to say, well, we're going to ignore that and keep plowing forward. Although I see a lot of people who do that. And they took that new information and saw a better direction, and they pursued that direction and adjusted the vision accordingly. So that takes a lot of confidence for you as a leader. In the area of competence, I want to highlight what they've discovered in kind of this part-time workforce that they have of aligning incentives with the behavior that they want to see, which isn't really something new. But what I think was really important was the very specific nature of how they kind of said, these are the things we want to see. We want to collect email addresses. We want to get the product really presented well on shelves, and then actually built an incentive system to help those people move along. So if you're building your business that way, how are you really ensuring that your incentive programs are aligned with where you want to go, and make sure that all of that's aligned with the vision of where you want to be as a business? And then in the area of calm, a lesson that I thought was great to go back and tell his younger self of enjoy and appreciate the process. When we're so deep in, it can kind of be, we're so worried about this stressful moment and that stressful moment. But there's a lot of joy in the learning and the growth. And I'm really glad Dan brought that to the fore, because that's such an important lesson for us to help us maintain our calm by realizing it is a process. We're going to look back on this and see the lessons learned as value. So thanks again, Dan, for sharing the story of your executive evolution. It was so good to hear and to reconnect with you. So remember, you can go from being an accidental leader to the greatest leader of all time. All it takes is developing your confidence, competence, and calm. See you next time on Executive Evolution.